Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the supernatural. With me is Richard SMOLEY, who is the author of the book, The Supernatural Writings on an Unknown History. Richard is also the editor of Quest, the Journal of the Theosophical Society in America, and he is the past editor of Gnosis magazine. In addition, he is the author of many books, including How God Became God, What Scholars Are Really Saying About God and the Bible, and Inner Christianity, the Guide to the Esoteric Tradition, and Hidden Wisdom, the Guide to the Western Esoteric Traditions. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Let's start by defining what you mean by supernatural.
Well, there's what we think of as the natural, which is what obeys, we think, the laws of physics, the laws of biology as known. And then there are things that do not fit into this in any sort of way. Sometimes these experiences are widespread. They're seen by many people. Sometimes they're very, very localized. They're only seen by one person, which is more likely the case. And they don't fit into the laws of nature, so they are bracketed as supernatural. Now, in this day and age, the supernatural is by and large equated with the illusory or imaginary or false or hoaxed. But most humanity over most of the course of human history has not seen it that way.
How do you see it?
I see it as the operation of laws and forces that current knowledge does not want to acknowledge or see or integrate into its worldview, because they believe that accepting these things would force them to jettison all the other things they think they know about even the natural world.
Well, as the editor of Quest, the Journal of the Theosophical Society in America, there's a wonderful case study about the supernatural, and you deal with this in your book, the idea of hidden masters, which is an important part of the history of the Theosophical Society, and not just the Theosophical Society, but the Society for Psychical Research in England, a supposedly objective group of scholars who investigated Madame Blavatsky and her claim of mysterious letters materializing in the ceiling from hidden masters. And they wrote a huge report back in the 19th century debunking her claim, and then 100 years later had to apologize.
Well, whenever you investigate something like this, you go in, like it or not, heavily armed with your preconceptions. And in a sense, very likely you've written this report in your head before you've started the research. Well, this is not the way you're supposed to do it, but it is what happens.
It's usually what happens, and I think one of the reasons is because in modern culture, anyone who comes out and says, we've investigated and we conclude the supernatural is real, they know they're going to be bombarded with hostile criticism.
Yes, and as you know much better than I, the world of parapsychology is haunted and vexed by this. It is very hard. I don't even feel comfortable saying this because you know it so much better than I do, but to do some research of this kind and try to take it seriously is, you have to just assume you're going to be made a laughing stock. And so it takes a lot of courage to investigate this stuff in a very scientific manner.
Well, let's talk about what we know about hidden masters.
All right. Well, what we know is very little and very elusive. Now, let us take some of the great spiritual figures of the 20th century. You already mentioned H.P. Blavatsky, who was founder of the Theosophical Society. Some of the others are Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian esotericist. There's G.I. Gurdjieff, the great, actually he was Greco-Armenian master.
I tend to think of him as Russian, but Greco-Armenian is...
It's correct, I believe. I believe that's correct. René Guénon was a very powerful French philosopher, and even C.G. Jung. Now, what's interesting about all of these figures, if you look at them biographically, every single one of them, there is no real indication of who their teachers were. Gurdjieff went off and studied somewhere in Central Asia, we think, and plus other places. He studied with people. He wrote about it. It is not agreed what Gurdjieff himself wrote about it, what parts were, shall we say, fictional and allegorical, and which parts weren't. But at one point, and he was not by nature a humble man, at one point he said to his pupils, I am small man compared to those who sent me. But we know nothing about them. Rudolf Steiner, when he was in his early adulthood, I believe, came across some old German or Austrian herb gatherer who introduced him to a master about whom I don't think anything is known, including his name. Jung was taught by this, and this is another aspect of it, of being on the inner planes that he called Philemon. René Guénon, who was in the occult world of France in the first decade of the 20th century. A lot of his writing, is based on Hindu thought, but what his connections were to Hindu thought and the Vedanta are unknown. So with all of these figures, we don't really know who taught them, and these are the big names. Behind the big names are figures who definitely do not want to be in the foreground. Why? Well, of course. Well, if you're an illumined master, what do you want? Do you want to be bothered by the press? You can see what would be written about you. There'd be all sorts of things debunking you. Who would want to be crazy enough to, get involved with something like that? I myself believe that there are such figures, that the better they are, the less publicity they want, and generally enjoin anyone who makes contact with them to basically a certain amount of secrecy, and that this has gone on for a long, long time. Go back to another. There was a figure, the old man in the mountain, who was a mystical Christian teacher of the 14th century, I believe. So this goes back a long, long way. And the idea that these figures exist, and up to a certain point, you don't have to believe in any supernatural things whatsoever to imagine that there are hidden teachers who stay out of the limelight.
And they communicate to select disciples or pupils via esoteric means, including appearing in dreams or telepathy or even materialization, or in the case of Madame Blavatsky, letters that materialize supposedly. And incidentally, those letters are currently in the collection of the British Museum.
Yes, you can still go and assume you have some real business looking at them. You can go and look at them to this day. I guess I would say, just as a caveat, that just to assume that there are these hidden masters doesn't necessarily force you to assume that they're communicating in all sorts of paranormal ways. In her case, she did make such claims. I myself am open-minded about, all of these supposedly materialized. Precipitated is the word that's used in theosophical circles. These letters were precipitated in a sort of quasi-photographic mystic process. I am agnostic about, are they really supernatural? As any stage magician will tell you can fake just about anything.
Right.
So I'm no personal commitment to like these things were real and they are real occult things. I am fairly convinced that these figures that she talked about were actual human beings on the physical earth, as they said they were. and that she was being taught by them in some kind of way or another. About the paranormal stuff, it's a long, long time ago. All these people are dead, and hanging your belief system on something that may not have been the case is not a wise thing to do.
Well, even though these events reported by the Theosophical Society occurred in the early 20th, late 19th centuries, they seem to be consistent with philosophical spiritual traditions, both Eastern and Western, that go back thousands of years.
Yes, and I think just about all traditions have some version of this, and there are teachers on inner planes. In the 16th century, there was a Jewish Kabbalist named Joseph Caro who had all his teachings, he said, from an inner teacher, or Magid, which is simply Hebrew for teacher, that transmuted it this way. More recently, you have channeled material, and channeled material, as you know, is of widely varying quality. Most of it is, frankly, pretty banal.
Yes.
But there are a couple of ones that stand out. One is the Seth material of Jane Roberts. The other, in my view, is A Course in Miracles, which is transmitted allegedly by Jesus Christ himself to a woman, a New York psychologist who was basically an atheist.
And remained an atheist even after transmitting all of this material. Helen Schuckman, a woman I knew.
Did you?
Yes, indeed.
Well, one thing that I was told about her recently, she was planning her memorial service shortly before she died, and she told her loved ones, don't mention the Course during the service because all my friends are going to be there. So not only was she not like this, crazed self-promoter, she was very, very discreet and even reluctant to associate herself with it. So you have to, take self-promotion or grandiosity out of the picture in that case. And what you have is a profound statement of mystical Christianity, although it would take a long time to say what the Course is really about. I would say it's not only the greatest spiritual text of the 20th century, but it is the only Christian theology that I've ever seen of any kind anywhere that is not, to some degree or another, just self-contradictory. It follows from its premises in a logical way, whereas all the others, eventually end up taking refuge in mystery. Oh, well, it's a mystery. Well, you can hide behind. There is a genuine thing as mysteries, but there are also such things as logical paradoxes and logical corners that you paint yourself into. And although you're willing to evoke mystery and that kind of thing, on your own behalf, people who do that are rarely willing to grant the same favor to people who disagree.
Well, it strikes me that when we're talking about the supernatural here, there are two elements. One is the philosophical element, that can we hold a worldview in which there are mysteries, things that will forever remain beyond the understanding of rational logic and science. And then the other element of it is the practitioner element. Can we invoke spirits? Are we able to, through various rituals and practices, get in touch with these powers and manifest miracles in our lives?
And one could take that in a lot of different directions. I think there are a lot of people who have dipped their toes into this water.
Yes.
I mean, the classic, kind of cliche example is the bunch of girls who get a Ouija board together and, half the time, oh my God, this works. Or, I mean, there are these books on teen Wicca and teen witchcraft. This girl, reads this book and makes some kind of spell, and oh my God, it works. And the sane, sensible response is to get scared and just let it drop, which is what most people do. Then there are some people who say, "Wow, this is neat," and those are the ones who get into trouble. There are a small number, the smallest of all, who say, well, there's something here. I don't necessarily want to use it to, win the lottery or, get Taylor Swift as my next girlfriend. But there's something, real here, and let's explore it. And I think those end up becoming the serious seekers.
Mm-hmm. And there are many different groups that have a combination of philosophical, psychological teachings and various ritual practices designed to invoke supernatural powers, including many mainstream religions.
Yes. Yes, I mean, those, rituals, let's say the Christian rites of the Eucharist and so on, are, in a sense, acts of theurgy, sacred magic, divine magic. They're very, very ritualized and structured, so presumably they can't be abused. But a ritual that's repeated over and over again in a somewhat mindless way becomes rather mechanical.
And stale.
And you could ask if that hasn't happened with certain Christian sacred mysteries. Then, of course, there are the perversions of it, the black masses and so on, where you do everything the opposite. You have a black host. You recite the Lord's Prayer backwards and that sort of thing. And that, is meant to kind of evoke the nether entities.
And some of what I gather is associated with Satanism and black magic is actually a form of social protest.
Yeah. Well, Satanism as we know it today, as I understand it, got its start in the court of Louis XIV, Versailles, which was a pretty amoral atmosphere. Everybody cheating on everybody else, everybody, backstabbing everybody else. And this priest came and he started, here's the latest novelty, do a black mass. And they got into it for a while. And finally, the king drew the line and, put this priest in jail and said that was that. But this whole kind of concept of the black mass kind of continued. Its most famous description is in a book called Là-bas over there by a French novelist called Eastman. And this guy goes to a black mass and he describes it. And the author presumably did this. We don't know exactly how it turned out because in the novel, the narrator gets disgusted by what's going on and leaves. So you can only imagine what went on after that.
But this is a novel.
It's a novel, but it apparently did to some degree reflect certain occult practices.
Because there were certainly many, many claims about satanic rituals, and it's quite controversial. You have the False Memory Foundation, and you have, on the other hand, the Church of Satan.
Yeah. Well, the Church of Satan is interesting. It was founded by a former carnival barker named Anton Zandor Lavey.
Yes.
And he cobbled together his satanic Bible from a number of sources. And one of the most important academic scholars of Satanism, an Italian named Massimo Introvigne, says that the chief ideological influence on Mr. Lavey was none other than Ayn Rand. Because what he's talking about in the satanic Bible of his is, the triumph of individual will. Everybody else be damned. It's about me. I hell with all of these codes that, tell me to be a nice person and, turn the other cheek. I'm not going to do that because that's just bull. So weirdly, Ayn Rand, the darling of, the conservative right, turns out to have been kind of, one of the apostles of Satanism as it manifested in the late 20th century.
Well, I see the correlation, but even before Ayn Rand, you had Aleister Crowley.
Yes.
Pronouncing the law of magic, do what thou wilt.
Yes, and Crowley was an extremely paradoxical figure. And the more I look into this stuff, the more I tend to think of it in terms of taste.
Yes.
That is to say, well, what is your taste in food? Well, I don't really like spicy food. I really, and so on. And in occultism and spirituality, I tend to see more and more in this light. And Aleister Crowley is for people who like strong, pungent, and slightly rank flavors in their spirituality. I have to say, A, that's not for me, and B, if it's for you, all well and good. But it was definitely, an attempt to transgress. And there's a power in transgressing limits because a limit of any kind, in a sense, contains energy.
Yes.
Once this limit is released or broken, the energy flows out.
Well, what you're describing here sounds to me very much like Tantra, which must be one of the oldest traditions dealing with the supernatural.
It is. And I've read several books on Tantra, and heard any number of things about it. I still have very little idea of what it really is. Mm-hmm. Someone once did send me a manuscript about it when I was a book editor, and wow, these people knew what they were talking about. I may still have the manuscript. The company I was with didn't want to publish it for God knows what reason. Mm-hmm. But Tantra kind of just means so many things at this point that usually it means some kind of arousal of the sex force to turn possibly to magical ends.
And a transgression of social norms.
Yes, because the tantric rituals, involve, what, 5 M's. They all have the begin with the letter M in Sanskrit, but 3 are wine, meat, fish, sexual intercourse. Mm-hmm. I have not done any of this, and I don't really know anyone personally who's ever told me about it in any great detail. Okay. It's one of those things where I have a strong sense that if I had any experience with it or really knew much more about it, my ideas about it would be very, very different. Mm-hmm. Conceptually, I'm willing to say, yeah, this is all part of that whole, milieu. And, when you transgress boundaries, you release energy, and you don't necessarily know what these energies are going to do. There is a funny story about Aleister Crowley, who decided that he was going to invoke some rather powerful entities, some kind of ritual involving the watchtowers, which I think he did in 1909 or 1910. And he claimed it was successful, and that all this energy was released. I think he kind of liked to believe that these energies somehow brought about the First World War, which, although 30 million people were killed, that's so what? Yeah. That means I'm a really powerful magus. Yeah. But there's a certain amorality to it because you want to kind of see what you can do. Inevitably, you get your fingers burned.
Well, you use the term magus, and that's a term that is often associated with the esoteric traditions associated with the supernatural.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can talk a little bit about occult magic, and if we want to start somewhere to define it in some kind of way, you could say it is the raising of certain power, and this power exists, and I can show you that it exists if we have time. I'm not going to do it, but I can describe it. And you channel it toward a certain goal or a certain end, usually by means of some kind of visualization or some ritual that corresponds to your aim.
Yes.
The power is easily raised, and it's often completely accidentally raised. The most obvious example is the high school dance, where all the boys are on one side, all the girls are on the other. There's an intense charge, almost electrical in feel, in the room. Mm-hmm. And one way of generating this power is put all the men on one side, put all the women on the other, and just have them project energy. You can just simply do this in the comfort and privacy of your own home. Mm-hmm. In this high school auditorium example, people are doing it unconsciously. Mm-hmm. And then the ice gets broken, one couple starts to dance, and the whole, the next phase of the chemical romance starts to begin. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times this is present. It's present in arguments. It's present in business negotiations. If one person wants something, the other person wants something else, they're sitting in the room and they may be perfectly just civil to one another, but there's this tension and this energy, and it's usually experienced as uncomfortable. Yeah. And the first one who breaks said, okay, you win. The person who wins the negotiation is the person who can, in a sense, stand this energy the longest. Mm-hmm. I want to say that some people probably do this consciously. I believe a great deal do it unconsciously.
Yeah, I recall some years ago in a international chess match, some of the Russian chess players were complaining about parapsychological means being used against them?
Well, the Russians have done, they've looked into that. They've looked into the occult uses of these for things that may not be necessarily be good ends. I have a Russian emigre friend who once said he met someone who had been trained as a psychic killer by the KGB. And my friend took it seriously. Whether this man actually could kill someone else psychically, I don't know. I'm willing to bet, a good sized dollar that if the KGB tried to find out if they could do this, maybe they succeeded, maybe they didn't, but I'm sure they tried.
They may have been inspired by anthropological literature on death by hexing rituals.
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is, if these powers exist, they exist in all of us to some degree or another, and they can be utilized to some degree or another. Now, my impression of the parapsychological research is all of the stuff that's been done, all of the meta-analyses of the experiments and so on have been done. And what it comes down to, it seems to be, is that there is very strong, well beyond statistical evidence for a force called psi, PSI, in the human mind, but it is fairly weak. And if you look at this actually corresponds, I would say, with ordinary experience. Because these things happen, but in our lives they're always kind of out of the corner of our eyes. They happen, but then they they just sort of happen. Well, why would they not happen that way? Because we're a culture who is conditioned not to believe in it. If you were in a culture that, for some reason, believed that music did not exist, someone might play music, someone might even develop the ability or have the ability to play music, but it would certainly be, musical talent would certainly be very attenuated in such a culture. And I think that's the case with modern Western civilization and psi abilities.
Well, Richard Smoley, what a wonderful discussion. I know we could go on for hours. This is one of my most fascinating topics. And I can say, just speaking personally, yes, it's a small, sometimes very, very elusive, subtle phenomenon, but in my case, it changed my life. And I know other people would say the same thing.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.